Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Imagine you're sitting at home, minding your own business, when your phone rings. You pick up, and a voice on the other end says, "This is the police. We have a warrant for your arrest, and your deportation starts today." Your heart stops. Your hands shake. But is it real, or is it a trap? Today, we're diving into a story of pure terror. We're following an immigrant named Mateo through the longest 10 minutes of her life as she faces a high-pressure scam. This isn't just a story, it's a survival guide. In this video, we're going to look at the psychological tactics scammers use to target people, and more importantly, we're going to learn the specific English vocabulary and red flag expressions you need to know to protect yourself. Let's get into Chapter 1.
It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of mundane, quiet day where the only sound in Mateo's apartment was the rhythmic hum of the dryer. He was standing at his small dining table, folding a warm pile of laundry, thinking about what to cook for dinner. His mind was drifting toward grocery lists and weekend plans until his phone vibrated against the wood. The screen displayed a restricted number. Mateo hesitated. Usually he didn't answer unknown calls, but he was expecting a follow-up about a recent medical checkup. He swiped to answer. "Hello? Is this Mateo Vargas?" The voice was cold, sharp, and carried the heavy weight of authority. It wasn't the friendly tone of a clerk. "Yes, this is he," Mateo replied, his voice shrinking. "This is Officer Miller, calling from Federal Immigration Services, badge number 4419. Are you currently at your residence at 422 Maple Street?" Mateo froze. The mention of his address felt like a physical hand tightening around his throat. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had worked for years to ensure his paperwork was perfect, but the mere mention of immigration services carried a primal power. Yes, I am. Is there a problem?" "There is a severe clerical discrepancy in your 2024 status filing, Mr. Vargas," the officer snapped. "An immediate warrant for your arrest has been signed by a federal judge. We have a patrol car currently being dispatched to your location." The heartbeat began to quicken. Mateo's legs felt weak, and he sank into a chair, the half-folded shirt slipping from his fingers. The mundane safety of his living room had vanished in a single breath. "Mr. Vargas, do not interrupt me," the officer barked when Mateo tried to explain that his visa was current. The coldness in the man's voice made the air in the room feel thin and freezing. "Our records show an inconsistency in your tax declarations and your residency history. It is a federal offense to provide false information." "But I have all my receipts," Mateo stammered, his mind racing through folders of neatly organized documents in his desk. "The time for receipts has passed," the caller countered. "The system has flagged this as intentional fraud." Mateo felt a drop of sweat slide down his temple as the caller began reciting his life back to him like a script. The man knew the exact date Mateo had landed at the airport 3 years ago and the name of the construction firm where he worked. How could a criminal know these things? Only the government could have such a detailed file on his life. I am a law-abiding person. I don't understand how this happened," Mateo whispered, his hands trembling so hard he almost dropped the phone. "The law doesn't care about your intentions, Mr. Vargas. It cares about the warrant that is active right now." The caller explained that because of the fraud flag, Mateo was no longer eligible for a standard court hearing. Every bit of logic Mateo possessed was being drowned out by the sheer volume of his own pulse. "You are being classified as a flight risk," the officer added. "If you leave that apartment before we arrive, it will be much worse for you." Panic overrides logic. Mateo looked at the front door, half expecting to see the handle turn at any moment. He felt like a trapped animal in the very home he had worked so hard to build.
The silence of the apartment was suddenly punctured by a sharp, rhythmic wailing coming through the phone. It was the unmistakable sound of a distant police siren, rising and falling in a chilling loop. "Do you hear that, Mr. Vargas?" the caller asked, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "That is the sound of your life changing forever. That patrol car is already 3 blocks away from your front door." Mateo's breath hitched in his chest as he stood up and moved toward the window, pulling the blinds back just a fraction of an inch. The street outside was bathed in the gray light of the afternoon, looking deceptively peaceful and ordinary. "I don't see them," Mateo whispered, his eyes searching frantically for a flash of blue and red lights. "They are coming around the corner now," the officer claimed. "They have orders to take you into custody in front of your neighbors." The thought of being let out in handcuffs with the people from his building watching felt like a hot iron pressing against his skin. He imagined the shame, the questions, and the terrifying uncertainty of where he would be sleeping that night. "Please, there must be a mistake," Mateo pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of the psychological pressure. The siren on the other end grew louder for a moment, then faded into a dull digital drone that vibrated against his ear. The walls of his apartment, which he had painted himself just last summer, suddenly felt like the 4 sides of a cage. He felt the urge to run, to hide in the closet, or to bolt out the back door, but his feet were anchored to the floor by fear. The sound of the siren was a weapon, and it was working perfectly to shatter his ability to think. He was no longer a man in his home. He was a target, waiting for the strike.
"Listen to me very carefully, Mateo," the caller commanded, his tone shifting from aggressive to strangely protective. "If you hang up this phone, or if I hear another person's voice in the room, I will signal the officers to breach your door immediately." Mateo's thumb hovered near the screen, his instinct screaming at him to call his brother or the lawyer who helped with his green card. "Do not call your lawyer," the officer snapped, as if he could read Mateo's mind through the lens of the camera. "As of 5 minutes ago, your rights to a private counsel have been suspended under the emergency security protocol." Mateo felt the last thread of his safety net snap, leaving him suspended in a void of total helplessness. "If you involve anyone else, it will be considered obstruction of justice, and that adds 5 years to your sentence," the voice continued. Mateo looked at his laptop on the desk, wanting to search for the officer's name, but he was too terrified to move his hands. The caller demanded that Mateo put the phone on speaker and place it on the table so they could hear every movement in the room. "I need to know you are alone. I need to know you aren't trying to hide anything," the voice muttered. Mateo obeyed, his movements robotic and stiff as he felt the invisible presence of the caller invading his private space. He was trapped in a digital tether, unable to reach out to the world and unable to let the world in to help him. The isolation was a heavy, suffocating blanket that made the caller the only reality left in his life. Total isolation is achieved. Mateo sat in the center of his kitchen, a prisoner in his own chair. He was completely alone, exactly where the voice on the other end wanted him to be.
"There is one narrow window of hope, Mateo," the officer said, his voice suddenly dropping to a confidential whisper. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but I see your clean record here, and I don't want to see a hard-working man ruined over a clerical error." Mateo leaned toward the phone, a desperate spark of hope lighting up in his chest despite the cold fear.
The federal judge has authorized a temporary stay of removal for cases involving administrative discrepancies, the voice explained. It's essentially a legal bond that freezes the arrest warrant and keeps the patrol car from pulling into your driveway. Mateo wiped his face with a trembling hand, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. How do I get this bond? What do I need to do? He asked, willing to do anything to stop the sirens. It requires a security deposit of $4,000, the caller stated firmly. This is not a fine, it is a refundable bond that stays in escrow. The number hit Mateo like a physical blow to the stomach, representing nearly every cent he had saved in his emergency account. I don't have that much in cash here, Mateo stammered, his eyes darting toward his wallet on the counter. We do not accept cash or bank transfers for security reasons. The system requires a digital voucher code to ensure the funds are untraceable by third parties. The logic was nonsensical, but to a man whose world was collapsing, it sounded like a complex government requirement. The caller insisted that the payment had to be processed within the next 15 minutes or the stay would expire. Mateo didn't stop to wonder why the government would want payment in vouchers. He only saw a way to make the nightmare stop. The financial bond was the hook, and Mateo was ready to bite if it meant he could stay in his home. He grabbed his car keys and his wallet, his mind focused entirely on the impossible task of finding $4,000 in minutes.
Mateo stumbled out of his apartment, his legs feeling like lead as he hurried toward the parking lot. The caller remained on the line, his voice buzzing in Mateo's ear like a persistent insect, reminding him that the clock was ticking. "Drive to the nearest pharmacy or big box retailer," the officer commanded. "Keep the phone in your pocket, but do not disconnect." The drive was a blur of gray asphalt and blurred lights. Mateo felt like he was moving through a dream where every red light was a personal threat. As he pulled into the crowded parking lot of a local grocery store, the world looked jarringly normal. He saw a young couple laughing as they loaded bags into their trunk and an elderly man slowly pushing a shopping cart. The contrast was agonizing. To the rest of the world, it was a beautiful afternoon, but to Mateo, the sky was falling. He walked through the sliding glass doors, the blast of cool air doing nothing to soothe the sweat prickling on his neck. "I'm inside," Mateo whispered into his shirt, feeling like a spy in a movie, though the stakes were his very life. "Go to the gift card section," the caller directed. "You need to purchase the high-denomination vouchers I mentioned." Mateo stood in front of a bright, colorful rack of cards, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grab them. He felt the eyes of a store employee on him and quickly looked away, terrified that any interaction would count as obstruction. The surreal nature of the task, buying pieces of plastic to stop a federal arrest, began to feel like a heavy weight in his chest. He was moving in a trance, driven by the singular, desperate goal of securing his safety before the 15 minutes ran out. The grocery store dash was a race against a phantom, and Mateo was losing his breath with every step. He approached the checkout counter, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a box.
Mateo stood at the checkout counter, his hands fumbling with the stack of plastic cards as the cashier began to scan them. "That's a lot of gift cards," the cashier remarked, with a friendly smile, trying to make small talk. Mateo didn't answer. He felt the weight of the phone in his pocket, a silent observer waiting for him to make a mistake. "Mr. Vargas, stop stalling!" The officer's voice suddenly barked through the speaker, no longer cold and professional. The voice was now high-pitched and jagged, dripping with a raw, ugly impatience that didn't fit a federal agent. "Tell the clerk to hurry up. I don't have all day for this garbage," the caller shouted, using a word that sounded like street slang.
Mateo froze, his fingers tightening around his wallet as the man's grammar slipped, the polished Officer Miller persona beginning to crack. The caller had gone from sounding like a government official to sounding like a frustrated bully in a matter of seconds. I am trying," Mateo whispered, but his mind began to pull back from the ledge of his panic. Why would a high-ranking officer in charge of a federal warrant use such informal, aggressive language with a citizen? "Just do it, man. Pay the money and read me the codes now," the voice demanded, the mask of authority falling away completely. The officer was gone, replaced by a desperate, greedy voice that seemed to be losing its grip on the situation. The first seed of doubt is planted. Mateo looked at the cashier, then back at the cards, a strange chill running down his spine. For the first time in 10 minutes, he stopped reacting and started listening, really listening to the man on the other end. The officer sounded less like a threat and more like a person who was terrified of losing a sale.
Mateo stood paralyzed at the register, his gaze drifting away from the demanding voice in his pocket. Just above the credit card reader, a bright yellow flyer was taped to the plexiglass barrier. "Stop, think, it's a scam," the bold letters screamed, followed by a list of red flags that felt like a summary of his last 10 minutes. The flyer warned about callers pretending to be government agencies, the use of high-pressure threats, and the demand for payment via gift cards. Behind the voice of the man on the phone, Mateo heard a distinct mechanical clicking sound, a loop of the siren recording restarting. The police station noise he had heard earlier wasn't a busy office. It was a cheap sound effect playing in a dark room somewhere far away. "Mateo, are you there? Pay the woman or the officers are coming in," the caller screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. Mateo looked out the large glass front of the store and saw a real police cruiser driving slowly through the parking lot. The car didn't stop at his apartment. It didn't turn on its lights. The officer inside was simply sipping coffee and turning toward the exit. The terrifying patrol car the caller promised was just a coincidence of timing or a complete fabrication. Everything that had felt like a solid wall of reality just moments ago was dissolving into a sequence of clever, cruel tricks. He realized the caller didn't have a badge or a warrant. He only had a script and the power of Mateo's own fear. The ghost in the machine was finally visible, and it was nothing more than a predator behind a keyboard. Mateo felt a wave of nausea hit him, not from fear this time, but from the realization of how close he had come to losing everything. He took a deep breath, the air in the grocery store finally reaching his lungs as the fog of panic began to lift.
Mateo stopped talking. The cashier looked at him with concern, her hand hovering over the keyboard, but Mateo didn't see her. He stood in the middle of the store, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the man on the other end descend into a frantic rage. "Mateo, answer me right now. Do you want to be deported? Do you want to lose your life?" the caller screamed. The threats that had felt like thunderclaps only minutes ago now sounded like the pathetic cries of a cornered animal. Mateo heard the caller breathing, heavy, jagged, and frustrated, and realized he was the one in control now. The silence stretched out between them, a long, cold bridge that the caller was terrified to cross. "You have nothing," Mateo finally said, his voice low and steady for the first time since the phone had vibrated on his table. The caller let out a string of curses, his professional officer persona completely shattered and replaced by a bitter, hollow anger. "You're dead, you hear me? The cops are coming," the man yelled, but Mateo could hear the defeat in the distance of his voice. Mateo didn't argue and he didn't explain. He simply moved his thumb toward the red circle on his screen. With a single, quiet tap, the connection was severed, and the frantic shouting was replaced by the peaceful hum of the grocery store. He hung up. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing Mateo had ever heard. He looked down at his hands. They were still shaking, but the terror was being replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He was still here. He was still safe, and the cage he had been living in for the last 10 minutes had vanished into thin air.
The deafening roar of the panic had finally subsided, leaving Mateo standing in the middle of the grocery store aisle. The cashier gave him a soft, knowing look, likely having seen this exact scene play out with other victims before. Mateo slowly put the unpaid gift cards back on the rack, his movements heavy but intentional. He walked out into the afternoon sun, squinting against a brightness that felt brand new. The world hadn't ended, the sky hadn't fallen, the neighbors were still just neighbors. He sat in his car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, waiting for his pulse to return to normal. He took out his phone and dialed his brother's number, just to hear a voice that actually loved him. "Hey," Mateo said when the line picked up, his voice thick with relief. "I'm okay. I just needed to hear your voice." He drove back to his apartment, the same route he had taken in a blur of terror, but this time he noticed the trees and the quiet streets. When he walked through his front door, the pile of laundry was still sitting on the table, exactly where he had left it. He picked up the half-folded shirt he had dropped and finished the job, one sleeve at a time. The scammer had tried to steal his money, but more than that, he had tried to steal Mateo's sense of belonging. As he put the clean clothes away, Mateo realized that his roots in this country were deeper than a fraudulent phone call could ever reach. The aftershock would linger for a few days, a ghost of a shiver whenever the phone rang, but the fear no longer owned him. He was home, he was legal, and he was standing tall. Mateo's story ended safely. But for thousands of people every year, these 10 minutes of terror end in heartbreak and lost savings. These scammers don't just want your money, they want to use your fear against you. But remember, knowledge is your best defense. If you ever get a call like this, remember the 3 red flags we learned today. Pressure, they want you to act fast so you don't think. Isolation, they tell you not to talk to anyone else. And payment, the government will never ask for gift cards or vouchers. Have you or someone you know ever received a call like this? Let's help each other out. Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be the warning someone else needs to hear today. It's also a great way to practice your English by describing what happened. If you found this story helpful and want to improve your English through more real-life scenarios, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm here to help you navigate the language and the world with confidence. I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.